VB.NET and C# are both .NET programming languages. They both compile down into the same intermediate language. So which language should you choose to develop in? Does it really matter? In this video, we're going to discuss the origins of VB.NET and C#, look at the two languages side by side, and look to the future of each as well. By the end of this video, you should have a much better grasp on why each of these languages exist and which one you should choose if you should one over the other. Now, if you've watched my other videos, you may have noticed that I cover everything C# related. What you may not know about me is that I spent a number of years in my early development career writing in Visual Basic 6 and VB.NET. So while I have my personal preferences, I do feel as though I can speak to both sides. Now, before we get started, I want to do a couple of brief housekeeping things. I'll keep this short. First, if you don't know me, my name is Tim Corey, and it's my goal to make learning C# easier. That means I try to take away the obstacles to learning C# well. I answer the questions like, why would I use this? And how does this fit into a larger application? Or when would I use this? These are questions that are often skipped over, but I have found the answers to be critical in truly understanding a technology. Now, in every video I have on YouTube, you'll find a couple of links in the description. One is to get added to my mailing list. I send out emails occasionally with new course announcements, course discounts, and more. The next link you'll find is the link to Patreon. Each dollar that comes in through Patreon gets poured into making more and better content for you to learn from. Now, finally, if there's any materials associated with a video, there'll be a link there to download them. Now, this topic today is an interesting one. It's not all just facts and figures. Part of it will be focused on opinions, perception, and personal circumstances. Those are different for each person. I would love to hear from you in the comments on what your thoughts are and what your experiences have been. I'll do my best to respond at least once to every posted comment. Okay, so let's get started. Now, to really understand where we are right now with the .NET languages, we have to go back quite a ways. So let's start by just briefly touching on the history. And the history starts with BASIC. Now, this is where I started as a developer. Now, I was very, very young. I'm not 80. But this right here is where I started as a developer. And BASIC was a wonderful programming language because it brought this complex software development thing down to a level where people that were just ordinary people could pick it up and learn to be a software developer. And so this was BASIC. And Microsoft said, we love this concept of anyone can do it. It's not just for the people who have PhDs. So they came out with this thing called Visual Basic. Now, this is where my professional career started, in Visual Basic. Visual Basic is a language that basically takes a lot of the features from BASIC and it puts a user interface on front of them and takes a lot of those same principles of ease of use and ease of understanding, and it brings it into a more modern, at the time, language. And so Visual Basic up through Visual Basic 6 came about. Now, Visual Basic 6 was last published in 1998, or about 21 years ago. So Microsoft, after Visual Basic 6, looked at what they were doing and looked at the software language of the time and said, we want to invest in something greater and bigger. And so they came out with the .NET languages, the Common Language Runtime. And the idea is that you can have multiple different languages, but they compile down to an intermediate language, it's called, or IL. And that IL is then run through the framework, the interpreter. And so with that, we got two new languages. We got Visual Basic.NET, which is an extension of this Visual Basic 6. It's more like a more of a spiritual successor than a true evolution, because there was some definite huge breaking changes, but it's pretty close as far as syntax. And then we got C#, which was more of a spiritual successor to like a C++. If you look at the two of them side by side, they're pretty close. So we have now two languages to work with in .NET. We have C# and VB.NET as the primary languages. Now, since then, other languages have come out, quite a few other languages, to handle mostly niche circumstances. So that's where we're at today, is the .NET languages. Now, that's just a really brief, high-level, skipped over a lot of details, summary of the history of why we got to where we're at. But let's do this. Let's open up a new project and build both a C# class library and a VB.NET class library that do the same thing. And that way you can see the differences in how each approaches the language. Now our code will be a little bit different, but since 2010, Microsoft had committed to what's called coevolution of C# and VB.NET, meaning the languages pretty much have the same features, they just go about in a different way. There's a few minor differences, but that's about it. Now, we'll talk more about coevolution because that's actually over now. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But for right now, most of what we'll do, in fact, all of what we'll do, is because of that coevolution, the idea that the features in one go over to the other language as well. So let's start a new project. I'm going to create a console app in .NET Core. And let's call this language comparison. And language comparison app is fine. And this is a console app in .NET Core, and it's a C# console app. Hit create. This is just going to be our application to kind of show off the fact that yes, both of these work the same way. So we won't spend a whole lot of time here. We'll get rid of the boilerplate code, and that's it. Now let's add two class libraries. So right click on the solution and say add new project. And I'm going to add a class library in .NET Core that's the Visual Basic language. And hit next. And I'm going to call this, let's call it VBLib. Hit create. And I'm going to delete class 1. I do that in all my class libraries. And I'm going to create a new project. And this one's going to be a class library in .NET Core. And I'll call this C#lib. Just so we are clear on which library is which. So now we have our three projects. We have our console application, which is just going to call these libraries. And we have our two class libraries. Let's delete class 1. Okay, so let's build a very, very small class inside of our C# library. Probably if you're on this channel, you are already more familiar with C# than you are with VB.NET. So this may be a little bit quicker for you, a little bit easier to understand. And then we'll go over to VB.NET and do the exact same thing, hopefully the exact same way or close to it. So let's create a class called demos. Make it public. And in here, I'm going to create a method that's a public list of string. That's what's going to return load file. So again, these are just demo methods. It's nothing you actually use in production. This is just to demonstrate the various parts of the languages. So in C#, we say public first, then we say what the return type is, or void if there's no return type, and then the name of the method. Now in here, I'm going to load a well, let's create our output first. List of type string, and that's going to be called output equals new list of string. That's what we're going to store whatever we're sending back through here. And then we're going to load a text file. So list of string, let's call this lines equals file, which control dot to add the using system.io. File dot read all lines. And we give it a file path, which I will give it the file path of c:/temp/test.txt. That's my test file. And I say .toList. Oops. ToList, which add the using system.link. And there we go. So now we have what it's going to do right here is going to read all the lines from this file and return it. Instead of an array, we're going to return it as a list of string. That's going to go into lines. We use the @ symbol in order to, because this right here, this backslash, is an escape character. If we did not have the @ symbol, we'd have to escape the escape character and essentially put 2 backslashes together for our path. It gets really confusing. The @ symbol just says, hey, this is a string that doesn't have any escape characters. Just go ahead and it's a string literal. Just literally take it for what its word is. Whatever it puts in there, that's what the text is supposed to be. Okay, so now we're going to do a for loop. And the reason we're going to do a for loop, lines.count. So I is less than lines.count. The reason we're going to do a for loop is we're only going to put every other line into the output. Not every line from the file, just every other line. So if I modulus or modulo 2 double equals 0, what that does is it says we're going to divide I by 2 and you're going to give me the remainder. So let's just say I is 3. 3 divided by 2, 2 goes into it one time with a remainder of 1 left over. So it's going to return 1 in that instance. If it returns 0, that means that 2 went into it evenly, therefore it's an even number, therefore we're going to say output.add lines like so. So we're going to grab the line at position 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Those lines. And finally, we're going to say return output. Like so. And that's our first method. We're only going to do one more, just so we have, again, a little bit more to play around with or compare. So public void print full name. We're going to take in a first name and a last name. And this is really simple. You probably shouldn't do this in a class library because we're going to talk to the console directly. But again, just for demo purposes. So we're going to say $, couple of double quotes, and our curly brace, first name, close curly brace, space, curly brace, last name, close curly brace. Just print out the first and last name. Okay? Oops. Control S. There we go. Now I'm going to add in above this method, I'm going to add in my XML comments. So this is our C# load file method. And we can leave the return empty, that's fine. And then down here, you probably shouldn't do this in a code comment. Or in a class library, not code comment. Because it's the console write line. Okay? So now we have a comment, we have our XML comments. The last thing I want to do is I want to add an interface. So I'm going to right-click on demos, go to quick actions and refactoring, and say extract interface, and just hit OK. And that's going to implement iDemos, which now has 2 things in it. Okay? That's the C# side of things. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to create a class in our VB lib. We're going to say add class. We're going to call this class demos, same name. And now what we're going to do is we're going to, let's split this horizontally. That we can kind of see what we did here. Let's start with recreating this method. Now the first thing you see right away, before you even start this method, is notice up here I have namespace C# lib. There's no namespace here. I have public class demos and then a curly brace, and at the very bottom I have a closed curly brace. I have public class demos and then an end class. That's one of the things that VB.NET does differently, is it does beginning and end. It doesn't do curly braces. So let's take on this method, the load file method. Let's give us some space here. Let's say public function. This is the first difference. Let me get through the signature line and then we'll talk about it. Load file as list of string. Okay, and now if I hit enter, it adds the end function for me. So public function, what does function mean? Well, function means it returns a value. Like we have here the return value. Function just says it will return a value. It doesn't say what the value is yet. The alternative is public sub, which does not return a value. So there's a difference. Now we have the name of our method, just like before, but then we have this as. And what this is doing is saying, here's my return type. So instead of putting it up front, it puts it afterwards and we say what the return type is. As list of string. Notice there's got an of, and it's the parens versus our angle brackets and just the type itself. Also notice the type is capital S. That brings up an interesting point about VB.NET versus C#. VB.NET is case insensitive, meaning a list is a list is a list. Doesn't matter how you case it. Now, the editor for cleanliness will usually change the casing to match the type. So, for example, if I were to type out string, that technically is right, but the editor just changed it over to be capital S, lowercase, the rest. So casing doesn't matter, which also means you can't have two variables with the same name, just different casing. Whereas in C#, you most certainly can. All right, so let's start with our output. So to declare a variable, you have to say dim first, and then you say output as. So you first say, this says, this is going to be a variable. That's all it says. It's not like var, where it's saying any type is fine. It's just saying, we're declaring a variable. And then the as will tell you what type. So as list of string equals new list of string. And we're done. A couple more things to point out here. First of all, we're getting very wordy. And this is one of my personal preferences, is this is very, very wordy, I think. This is a little more compact. The other thing is, on here I have my open and close paren, which kind of I do here with this open and close paren, but not really. And no semicolon at the end versus semicolon at the end. VB.NET does not have the concept of line terminators with some semicolons. All right, so now we need to create our lines. So dim lines as list of string equals file. We don't have file yet, so control dot to add system.io, which it says, up here it says using system.io. Down here it says imports system.io. Just a little bit different wording for it. So file dot read all lines. and I pass in my path. And I do my dot to list. Now, the sharp-eyed among you may have noticed I did not use my @ symbol in front of my string because that is not the escape character. Therefore, I don't have to put my @ symbol there. But also notice file.readAllLines. Just so you know, that's not the VB.NET version versus the C# version up here. It's calling the same code. So VB.NET has the same access to the same libraries as C#. They both have access to the same libraries. Okay, let's keep moving. I don't want to drag us on too much. 4. Going to use my snippet, so tab, and it says index equals 1 of 10 and next. So index should equal 0 to lines.count minus 1. Okay, so there's our for loop. And now we can use our if statement. So if, again, tab, if index mod 2 single equals 0, then. That's a little different too. So our for loop, up here we have our 3 declarations, our initial declaration of the variable, then our comparison, and then our incrementer. Down here, we have just a name, no actual declaration of the type. It just says, hey, it's going to be an int, but we didn't actually specifically say it's an int. And then there's our range that we're giving it instead of the comparison. And there is no, here's how much we're going to count by. It's just assumed that the next will go to the next value. Then in our if statement, we don't have any parens. It's just kind of out there. And we have a then at the end to indicate, okay, that's what you're going to do now. And then the end if says we're done with the if statement. Inside here, we don't have the idea of that % sign. VB.NET is pretty light on using those characters. The ampersand, it doesn't use that, it uses AND. Or, it doesn't use or, it uses OR. So there's some things there that it doesn't use as far as the kind of special characters like C# does. And one of them happens to be the modulus character, which is % in C#. We just type out mod. And it does the mod on these 2 values. So it takes in the 2, and it takes in this value, and it does the same thing. It does the division and finds the remainder and compares that against this, and it's single equals. So in VB.NET, the idea is this is a comparison because it's inside the if statement, whereas in C#, it could be a comparison or it could be an assignment. And so you have double equals for an assignment, double equals for comparison, single equals for an assignment. So again, little quirks here. Now we have the if statement, we can add this output.add. So output.add lines, and I need to grab just the specific line at the position of index. So I use my open paren and type index. Now I called it index down here because that's what they defaulted to, whereas up here they defaulted to I. So this could be I if you want to call it I instead. So with that being said, we now have the ability to return output. And now if we kind of move this around a little bit, now this right here matches this right here. So as you can see, there's actually more lines of code. There's 15 lines of code up top, and there's about 11 lines of code down below. So it feels like C#'s more verbose, but if you look at the actual code, there's less to it. So the actual characters, a lot less. So this right here, let's just compare this line. So we've got all these characters, whereas here, it's mostly this configuration. And it goes on kind of like that. I mean, even declaring our variable, this right here versus this. It's just a little bit more compact in the C# side. Again, it can be a personal preference, but I just want to point out those differences. Now let's move on to our print full name. So we can see that sub. So public sub print full name, first name as string, last name as string. And then we can just hit enter afterwards to complete the end sub. And we can say, we can't say CW tab tab. There is no snippet for that. So we have to say console.writeLine. And then we can actually do the exact same syntax. I'm going to actually copy and paste this down below. It's the same syntax. It works just fine. But notice, again, no semicolon at the end anywhere. So there's our method. Now, let's add an interface to this. So right-click on Demos, Quick Actions and Refactoring, Extract Interface, and hit OK. And here's a couple of differences. First of all, up here we have colon and then iDemos. Down here we have implements iDemos. A little bit different. But it's a little bit more than that. Down here on our public load file, we now have implements idemos.load file. It declares where each item in the interface is implemented. Same thing down here. Implements idemos.print full name. Notice how big this could get. I mean, down here, this stays the same no matter how many interfaces we have. If we have multiple interfaces up here, we can get really messy in this. Okay, that can be, we have a lot after on this signature line for our method. So that's another way that, again, VB.NET, just wordier. It's got more stuff to it. So let's do this. Let's close out of these and open up our program.cs. I just want to kind of demonstrate that, yes, first of all, these two are the same. And second of all, it doesn't matter if we're running C# or VB.NET, we can call these libraries. So first, let's add a reference and our dependencies, add references to both of these projects. So both the C# lib and the VB lib. And now what we can do is say vblib.demos. I'm going to do the full name instead of adding a using statement up top because of the fact that I've named both of them the same thing. And I don't want to confuse C# as to which is which. So, and let's call this VB equals new in that class. And let's grab the list of results. I can just do var VB results equals VB.load file. That's that first method we call. And then let's do a console write line first that says VB.NET call, or calls. Let's just call. Just to show us that, yes, we're doing a VB.NET call now. And we'll do a for each on the results. So each item in VB results, and we'll just write out that item. So we're just going to loop through that list and write out each of the items. Now I've got a text file in there, that test.txt. It's got, I think, like 6 names in it or so. Now what we're going to do is do the exact same thing but for C#. So let's first put a couple of blank lines in between. And now we can say C#lib.demos, and we'll say this is called C# equals new C#lib.demos. And now we can say var C# result equals C# dot load file. And now we can do the console write line that says C# call, and do our for each that looks over the C# results and prints out that same item. Okay, so the exact same code twice, but one is calling the VB code, one is calling the C# code. And if we run this, there we go. So we have the VB call that gets Tim, Corey, Gimli, and Captain Marvel, whereas the C# call gets Tim, Corey, Gimli, and Captain Marvel, which is good because it's the same file. But that illustrated a couple of things. First of all, my code was functionally the same. And in fact, if we looked at the intermediate language comparison of those two DLLs, they would be the same. Because in intermediate language, they both get compiled to the same thing. So even though one is VB.NET and one C#, they'll both be the same in IL, which means that we can have our C# console application call either one without an issue. So what does this mean for us? Well, it means a couple of things. And the first one is that VB.NET and C# are pretty much equal as far as use. You can use either one and accomplish the same things. You'll do it in a different way. We've seen that, especially in things like the interface and declaration of variables. But the end result is the same thing. You get to the same place, even if the syntax is a bit different. So that's one thing it means. The other thing it means is even if you have, let's just say you have C# code, but now you want to start in VB.NET. You can put that C# code in class libraries if it's not already there, and then call it from VB.NET. Or vice versa. You can have all of your legacy VB.NET code in DLLs and call that from C#. So it makes it very easy to switch between the two languages or to move from one to the other. And that brings up something I mentioned earlier, which is back in 2010, Microsoft said, we're going to co-evolve VB.NET and C#, meaning the feature set will be in parity. We'll have the same features in both whenever possible. However, in February of 2017, Microsoft said that they're done doing co-evolution. VB.NET and C# are going to start branching apart from each other because they don't want to spend the time making sure that every feature goes into both languages. And so there will be the idea that some things come to one language but not the other. Now that may raise some question marks in your mind. Okay, if they're not going to be exactly the same anymore, which one does Microsoft love more? And that's not the best question because Microsoft, even though they love certain things a lot and other people don't, the reality is they focus on what people use or people want, which means we should look at which one's more popular. And to that end, let's pull up this web page and move on to the Stack Overflow survey results of 2019. Now, before we get into this, I do want to give you a couple disclaimers. First of all, yes, they surveyed 90,000 developers. However, this does not mean it's a totally accurate survey. It may not be accurate for your area. It may not be accurate for the types of development because of who uses Stack Overflow. If a certain group of people didn't find Stack Overflow helpful, then they would not have been necessarily included in this survey because they wouldn't have known about it. So while this is, it has some statistical significance to it, that does not mean it tells the complete story for everywhere and for everything. Okay? So I want to make that clear up front. Now let's go to technologies in use and look at the most popular technologies. And we can see that, now notice that one person may use more than one technology. So even though this is not, total up to 100%, obviously 67 plus 63 is more than 100% already. But most popular, JavaScript, HTML, CSS, SQL, Python, Java, Bash, or PowerShell or Shell, and then C#, and so on down the list. What you do not see anywhere on this list, and this list goes all the way down to 1.2% with WebAssembly, what you don't see on this list is VB.NET. Anywhere. If we come down to our other frameworks, libraries, and tools, we see .NET and .NET Core, but specifically, it doesn't mention anything about VB.NET. In fact, if we go through this entire survey, we have the loved, dreaded, and wanted not on the list. Not dreaded, not loved, not wanted. Essentially, it's ignored. However, there is the VBA, which is the Visual Basic for Applications, which is actually a flavor of Visual Basic, but it's not VB.NET for sure. So nowhere in this survey, in the top 20 or so results of any category, will you find VB.NET at all. You will find C# in almost every area, loved, hated, or dreaded, and wanted. Okay? You'll find it in used. You'll find it in pretty much everything, including there's ASP.NET for most loved web framework. Now, really quick off topic, but I do want to point out development environment. And this is where I think Microsoft, this is an indication of Microsoft's turning a corner. The most popular development environment, Visual Studio Code. For all respondents, for web developers, mobile developers, it's just behind Android Studio. And then for DevOps, it's out in front again. That's a free open source tool that Microsoft has given away. That's just a side note, something to definitely look into, even as a C# developer, because it does develop in C# across all platforms, Windows, Mac, and Linux. Okay, sorry, back on topic. So Visual Basic.NET is not found in any of these lists. Does that mean it doesn't exist? Well, of course not. It exists. If we go to Stack Overflow and search for the tag VB.NET, you'll find roughly at this time 124,902 questions. So in the history of Stack Overflow, that's how many questions have been asked about VB.NET, which is pretty significant. However, let's compare that with C# at 1.3 million questions. That's an order of magnitude difference. So C# is much more popular. Now, does that mean that if it's more popular, you should definitely do it? No, of course not. However, when it comes to looking for jobs, C# is much more popular. When it comes to looking for help, C# is much more popular. When it comes to looking for tutorials or whatever resource you want, you're more likely to find it in C# than you are in VB.NET. And that comes back to Microsoft branching and going away from the idea of coevolution. With that, Microsoft's primary focus is on C#. That tends to be Microsoft's go-to first language for anything .NET. So that raises the question, should you learn VB.NET? To which I can only answer in general. In general, no. I would focus primarily on C#. However, there are a number of niche areas where VB.NET is the language of choice. So if your area is one where you have a number of VB.NET jobs, yeah, that might be a thing to learn. Okay? You can also look at the idea of if there's less VB.NET developers out there, there's less competition for the VB.NET jobs. That is a possibility. Now, the danger there, though, is as companies move on, they will have less and less VB.NET developers. So you are putting yourself in a place where your job may be in danger more than if you were a C# developer. However, with C# developers, there is more competition. So there is that balancing act to go through. At the end of the day, right now, they are functionally the same. C# 7.3 brought out a couple of things that weren't in and aren't in VB.NET. And I don't believe they're coming to VB.NET. That will happen more as we progress towards .NET 5. So that is something to think through. But at the end of the day, this is a personal choice, and it is something that you have to make for your own self. If you were to ask me for advice, I would say in general, VB.NET was a great transition platform for VB6 developers. It's great for moving us off of VB6 and into the .NET ecosystem. However, at some point, the thought was that we convert over to C# and move that direction. Microsoft is making it more and more obvious that C# is the way to move forward, and so I would encourage you to learn C#. Now, those are my thoughts. Those are my thoughts on the whole VB.NET versus C#. I would love to hear what you have found in the practical world. I mean, obviously, I can say all day long that this is better, but if you find in your area that it's not, then it's not for you. Okay, so I'm speaking in generalities, but I'd love to hear your specifics and what your experience has been. Have you done VB.6 or VB6 and moved to VB.NET and then C# like I did, or do you get stuck along the way somewhere? Okay? Either way, thanks for watching. I appreciate it, and have a great day.